All right. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. Great to see you all out there, and we'll let me fix this. Yeah, overlay. So we'll go ahead and get started. So one of the things I want to go ahead and talk about is this idea of the right fit. And when people typically talk about micro inequities, the right fit is one of those things that oftentimes comes up. And so, what is it that people are looking for? What are they trying to go after? And what I would suggest is that people are oftentimes looking for the same things. And so, we're looking for safety, significance, and belonging. And when those things don't come, when we don't get access to those things, we feel very lost, we feel very betrayed, and we feel that the systems that are supposed to guarantee those things aren't working for us. And so you get things like protests, and you get things like riots. You get people who don't give their best at work because of these micro inequities, because they feel that their safety, significance, and belonging is not being honored. So that becomes extremely important to recognize. We also know that all human beings have the ability to learn, change, and grow, even in the face of not seeing those things, not recognizing, or people not recognizing it within themselves. So the capability for learning, for changing and growing is always present. We also know that people do what they think works, even if it doesn't. And they typically exude those behaviors, or they have those behaviors because they have been beneficial in the past. And because they've been beneficial in the past, we assume that the present, they will also be beneficial. We also assume that in the future, I can use those same behaviors. The problem is that people who operate from that paradigm typically have forgotten that it is context that determines whether something is working or not. And that is goal setting that determines whether something is working or not. And I will tell you that as a 45-year-old man, my goals are different than when I was an 8-year-old boy. And so my behaviors and the things that I'm looking for are also different. So I have to make sure that there's a congruency between my behavior and the goals that I have. We also know that all human behavior is goal-directed and is directed towards that idea of safety, significance, and belonging. And so when when micro-inequities occur and they become a blockage, or they slow my access to that, that becomes problematic for me. So we're always goal-oriented. We're always trying to get something. And lastly, attitude is a reaction to goals, and typically we talk about the emotional response to emotional positioning, right? But rarely do we talk about the fact that goal accomplishment actually is, or attitudes are the result of goal accomplishment. So when I have reached my goals, I have a good attitude. And when I'm delayed in reaching my goals, I have a bad attitude or a negative attitude. And so instead of responding to the emotional response to those things, if we want to be helpful, we have to help people understand and question what are the goals that behaviors are trying to accomplish. So we're going to go right into our lesson. The thing that I want to remind you of is that if you are in need of CEUs, please email me, and you can email me at Andre at amhorizons.com, and we'll get you those CEU certificates for this particular course. So I'm really excited to talk about this with you today. So the first thing that we'll talk about is this idea of the micro-inequities and discretionary effort and their relationship to each other. If you look in the chat room, you'll see kind of what our outline is for the time that we'll spend together. The first is that we'll talk about what microaggressions are and micro-inequities. Secondly, we'll we'll talk about how do they impact the workplace or in the school setting, and ultimately how do they impact individuals. We'll also talk about this idea of discretionary effort and what that is. We'll also talk about some strategies in appropriate behaviors for schools, school environments or educational environments and workplace environments. Lastly, we'll talk about how do we create better spaces for these interactions, these good human interactions. And then lastly, we'll have some space for questions if you have some. So first, we'll talk about this idea of micro inequities and its direct relationship to discretionary effort. And one of the things that I want us to recognize is that microaggressions, microabrasions, all those small things add up to some very significant and profound things that we will call micro inequities. So it's the family of these small negative behaviors that culminate in what we will call micro inequities. And there's a direct relationship to discretionary effort, and we'll spend some time talking about those. So first of all, we know that people are looking for the dignity and honor in being human. And so when we talk about that, dignity is simply recognizing that people can exist and they have the right to exist just as they are. They are born demanding our respect. We know that honor is the highest level of respect that we give folks, and we typically give folks honor when they've done things for us that we could not do for ourselves. So servicemen and women, protective service folks, police officers, judges, all of these folks have done things on our behalf that we could not do for ourselves. And so we give them honor, great respect. And next is being. None of us have done anything to bring ourselves to this planet. We all accepted an invitation, and I don't like to think about how that invitation came because it's a little disgusting, but we all accepted an invitation, and we're trying to figure out what it means to be human. And human has two definitions. One is that of a biped, having two legs, having opposable thumbs, a big brain, and a belly button. If you ever encounter a person without a belly button, be concerned. And so when we talk about this idea of human, the first definition is that of a noun. The second is that of an adjective. And we know what adjectives do. Adjectives describe the nouns. And so when we talk about this idea of human, how is it that we want to be described? And we know that we have different perspectives, different ways of thinking, and different paradigms. But at the core, we need to be giving people dignity and honor in being human, not because they can do something, but because they are, because they exist. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about a few paradigms. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is this. In this particular picture, you will recognize that there is ABC across the top and 1, 2, 3 along the bottom. And I'm going to talk a little bit about letter A. And in letter A, what you will see is that there's a picture of a bird with something in its mouth. You'll also recognize that that image holds, if you look at it upside down, there's also a tree, 2 trees, an island, a fish, and a person in a canoe. And it is that paradigm, the way we see the world, that allows us to either lift up humanity or to bring humanity down. And so paradigms are extremely important. And again, it's a fancy word, but it simply means the way you see the world. Or another way of saying that is world view. So when we talk about what are micro inequities or what are micro aggressions, it's simply the small things that occur that actually make us feel small. They are things that don't add to our humanity, but they actually detract from it. And they can be small comments. They can be things that are not discrimination, because we know that the 1964 Civil Rights Act clearly laid out in the subsequent acts clearly laid out what discrimination is. And so these are things that don't meet the threshold of legal discrimination, but they certainly don't encourage humanity or the recognizing of a human being as a whole person, right? So micro-inequities starts off with that, or microaggression. So when we also talk about this idea of microaggressions or microinequities, we have to recognize that this comes out of a question as to why is it that people do or don't succeed? Why do we engage people in certain kinds of ways? And why is it that racism and sexism and other forms of oppression are still present, even though we have more information, we have more knowledge, and so it comes out of that kind of thinking. And so we'll look at a couple of examples of these microaggressions, if you will, or micro inequities. So in this particular picture, and this comes directly out of some real life examples, where in an office place there was a person of high authority in the office place that would do what I would call these walk-by bombs, right? And so in this particular setting, the supervisor or the person with high authority walked past and he said, "Just like I like my employees, on their knees." And it was meant to be funny, but it certainly had the opposite or a negative side effect, because the people who heard that did not find that funny. It did not lift up humanity. It did not encourage people to work more efficiently, and it was really off purpose. And so when we talk about micro-inequities, they're typically off-purpose behavior that don't encourage people to work to the best of their ability or to operate to the best of their intelligence. And so what that actually does is it demeans or denigrates the employee in such a way that they don't want to give their best. And so that's where discretionary effort starts to creep its head. So when we talk about this idea of discretionary effort, it becomes very clear once we understand discretionary effort how those two things, how micro-inequities and discretionary effort feed into each other. And so discretionary effort is simply the amount of, let's do it this way. So when I'm hired for a job, they want 100% of my attention, of my talent, and of my skills. That's what they would like. However, they will still pay me if I give them 75%. So at the bare minimum, if I'm able to give them 75%, I get paid the same as if I were to give 100%, in all things considered, right? So when I feel attacked, either personally or professionally, when I'm experiencing these microaggressions, I may not necessarily be willing or feel confident to give 100% of myself. And so I may give 80%, or I may give, 78%, but I'm not willing to give 100%. And so micro-inequities become very important to recognize and to deal with, because it has actual impact on people's ability or willingness to give the best to the organization. And so that is something that we have to take into account and take into consideration, because as these things continue to happen, it actually creates a hostile work environment. And again, discretionary effort, negative discretionary effort, is a precursor to a hostile work environment, or it's a canary in the mine of a hostile work environment. And hostile work environments paired with harassment really opens up our organizations for some negative consequences that typically we are not prepared to or want to deal with as a result of negative behaviors. So if we can turn the tide on those things, we can get people to act better and have better places that we can interact with. So at this time, I'm going to open up the floor for questions. So if you have some questions or comments, please leave those. I'm going to check the chat room right now and see where people are. All right, so we'll go right back to our presentation. And so when we talk about this idea of discretionary effort, that becomes paramount, that we recognize that negative consequences of our behavior actually, or the allowance of that behavior can have real ramifications in the workplace. So those things are extremely important. Here's an example that I came across in my professional career, where oftentimes we don't recognize it, but posters, pictures, images, knickknacks in our office or our workspace that aren't directly related to the things that we're trying to accomplish in our work environment can actually decrease discretionary effort, particularly in others. And so when we have an example that would be a micro inequity, because it's not illegal to do this, but it certainly does not create a working environment that is helpful and conducive to the best of people's abilities. I had a client who had a black-faced doll, a Raggedy Ann that was a black-faced doll that they got when they were a child, and wanted to share it with another employee, and so they left it on the employee's desk without a note, without any kind of context, but wanted to have a follow-up conversation. And that act caused lots of harm in the organization, and it wasn't meant to be negative, but it certainly had a negative side effect. Other examples are certain members of the team being invited or not invited to early morning staff meetings, or the meetings before the meetings, or in some cases the meetings after the meetings. And so when we don't have that common information structure, when we don't share those types of events together, we oftentimes cause people not to want to give their very best, and so their discretionary effort can be impacted by that. So there's that. And also our paradigm is really impacted by what we've learned, what we've grown up with. And so I just want you to take a couple of minutes to look at this particular graph, and where did you get the images or the thoughts that you have about groups of people that you consider, or the people that share with you, consider to be different from you? Where did those concepts come from? So I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes to look at this particular diagram, and in your mind I want you to put a plus in one of the boxes where you get positive information. I'd like for you to put a minus where you get negative information, and I'd like for you to put a 0 where you didn't get any information at all. And so pluses, minuses, and zeros in this particular chart. And I'll give you about 45 seconds to just look at that and think about that. And you may even want to write that down on your paper. We will also have this particular chart available on the website, so you can download it and do this activity yourself. But I really want you to think about putting pluses, minuses, and zeros. Where did you learn the things you did about people groups that appear to be, or you've been taught, or people talked about that were different from yourself? And so for an example, Latino or Latina Americans, what did your parents and family teach you about those? Was it positive? Was it negative? Was that something you never talked about? What about friends or school? What did you learn about people with disabilities? Was it positive, negative, or 0? And so I'll give you just a couple more seconds to do that activity on your own, and then we'll go to the next slide. Also recognize that if folks have any questions, feel free to go into the chat room, ask those questions, join us on the conference call, which is 651-300-5500, and we'll be looking forward to interacting with you. So there's that. So I'll give you just a couple more seconds to finish that diagram of what you learned. All right, I'm going back to the chat room just to check in and see if folks have any questions. It doesn't look like anyone has any questions in the chat room. And for those who have logged into this webinar, the chat room is on the right-hand side of the screen, so feel free to do that. Post your questions there. You'll see our agenda there, and we'll continue on with this presentation. Again, if folks have questions, feel free to log in, ask. That would be super. I'll put back on my headphones. So, in terms of what microinequities do, they really hinder people's motivation to operate or willingness to engage in a working environment. And so it becomes paramount that we deal with those things, because if we don't, then we have a group of people, or we have folks in our organization that don't feel respected, engaged in some really profound ways. And some of the ways in which these things occur are pretty simple. So we'll go to this idea of first I'll talk about coercive motivation, right? So there's two types of motivation that I like to talk about. One is constructive motivation, and the second is coercive motivation. And coercive motivation is really based on this idea of fears, lies, and they're reactive. And so coercive motivation is constantly trying to motivate people using fear or lies or negative reactions to something. And so you'll hear people say things like, I have to pay my bills. Well, that is a reactive stance. That's a negative sort of motivation, because it says if I don't, something bad will happen to me. Where when we look at constructive motivation, it's really built on goals, it's built on courage, and it's built on being proactive. It's built on moving things forward. And so when we talk about micro-inequities, those are the things that are coercive. They're coercive motivation strategies that are oftentimes associated with the building of a hostile work environment, or in some place workplace bullying. On another end of the spectrum might even be this idea of racism or bigotry. In the worst case scenario, those things go unchecked and they become institutionalized, and then we have some really big problems when it comes to dealing with diversity in our workplaces and morale in our workplaces. So this idea of a hostile work environment can come in a number of different ways, and I remember this particular situation occurring where my female colleagues would actually walk around with legal pads in front of them, or wear jackets or sweaters in the most inconvenient in times. And I remember asking one of my female colleagues, why were people exhibiting this behavior that seemed kind of strange and obtuse? And one of the things that she shared with me was that in certain meetings with certain people, they had to protect themselves from wandering eyes. And when I say wandering eyes, what I'm referring to is people looking at their body parts as opposed to looking at their face when they're communicating with them. And so these are things that are not illegal. It's not illegal to do that, but it certainly does not build an environment where people feel safe to give their best. And I would suggest that if not addressed, that can lead to a hostile work environment. And a hostile work environment really has some particular thresholds that we'll kind of look at right now. And so this is an environment where people feel that their person is being attacked in such a way that they need to file or have a grievance that hasn't been recognized by the organization in such an effective way. So I'm going to take these headphones off just for a second. So that becomes really important, this idea of a hostile work environment. And the reason we want to deal with a hostile work environment is because this is a critical piece that can actually open up an organization to damages, to having some kind of legal standing around either the organization's ability or inability to reduce or to reduce a hostile work environment and build an inclusive or a collaborative work environment where people can give their best. But this is a really sticking point, because to ignore something is actually to support the person with bad behavior, and it actually exacerbates the problem. And so when we talk about this idea of a hostile work environment, this goes to this idea of back to micro inequities, in that this hostile work environment, if we follow these things, then we will be in a good place. We won't have anything to quote unquote fear, but we'll actually be able to have environments that engage people in productive and meaningful ways. And so first of all, we have to know that I don't do ballet in the workplace because ballet is not my job. The same principle should be applied to comedy in the workplace. If in your job title it says / comedian and other duties as applied, then feel free to tell those jokes in the workplace. But I often find that humor in the workplace can be a very tricky thing and a very difficult thing. And more often than not, it's a very off-purpose thing. It's not driving us towards the goals of the organization. It is made to oftentimes make an individual stand out for their wit and their comedy or their cleverness, when in fact those looking at those things are off-purpose behaviors. And so when we have those off-purpose behaviors, we're going down a very slippery slope. Particularly as it pertains to humor and jokes. Here in Minnesota, there's a group of jokes referred to as the Ole and Lena jokes. And the Ole and Lena jokes really talk about the simpleness of Ole and Lena. However, if we substitute Ole and Lena for a Polak or a Polak, then those things, the feeling of that joke really turns. Or if we use blacks or Jews or wetbacks, if we start using other groups in those jokes, that what was somewhat a benign joke often turns very ugly and negative. And so humor in the workplace has to be recognized. We also have to recognize that our purpose of working together or learning together is really around the organization's mission. And so if we're not on purpose, then we are off purpose. And so that creates a hostile environment, because sometimes we get confused and think that the people that we work with or study with are our friends, when friendship is not the key to why you're even relating to each other. It is the mission and goal of the organization that you either attend or that you sign a contract to work with. And so that should become paramount in any interactions that you have. And so dating in the workplace or other types of relationships or even friendships should be taken with the concept that the construct by which we know each other, the layout, the relationship that we have is actually based on our workplace and not necessarily on our friendship. And I'm not saying you can't have friends in the workplace, but what I am suggesting is that friendship should constantly acknowledge the method by which folks know each other. So there's that. There's also know that no is no, and know that you have to say something. Know that no is no, and know that you have to say something. and know that work is about work. And when we're able to do that, we're able to create an atmosphere where micro inequities don't happen. They don't become problematic. Um, and so that comes with practice. We have to be mindful of those things, because in our mindfulness, we're able to change our behavior. And so this is a diagram that asks you to do two things. First, the diagram asks you to name the words that you see. So yellow, blue, orange, black, red, green, purple, yellow, red, orange, green, black, blue, red, purple, green, blue, orange. Right? So it asks you to say those words. The next task I'd like for you to do with me, just really quickly, is I want you now to try to say the color of the words that you see. All right? So I'll give you just a couple of seconds to do that. All right, how did you do compared to reading the words? I would imagine that it was a bit more difficult for you to name the colors of those words as opposed to the colors that the words are written in. And so we have to be consciously mindful of these micro inequities and ask ourselves, how am I, ask ourselves and then ask other people for feedback around our micro inequities. So how was that taken? When I was in that meeting, what was going on there? Now, what I'm not saying is that we need to be paranoid or that we need to be hypersensitive, but I do believe that we need to have some folks that can help us refocus or look at our behaviors in a very critical way. I go to the doctor because the doctor can look at me and my symptoms in ways that I can't necessarily do, mostly because of my lack of training in that particular area. But he helps me to focus on that. So let's talk about this idea of reducing micro inequities and really creating an environment. So first is this idea of transparency, and I'm not suggesting that everything that we do we have to tell everybody about and all the company's secrets need to be exposed in a particular way. What I am suggesting is that this idea of transparency is that everyone knows what the chain of command is in a given area. People are familiar with the policies, that if we have expectations of people, those expectations are written down in such a way that people can have access to them. There have been tons of situations that I've been engaged in where people had expectations, but they didn't share what those expectations were until someone negatively or didn't meet those expectations, and then they want to have a conversation about the expectations. So that's problematic. Then we also, another thing that we have to do is really focus on goals. What are the goals of the organization? What are my goals as an individual? How do those things match? How do they pair? Is there a synergy between those two things? And when there is, we can have this opportunity to create not only equity, but encourage people to give their best. We also have to make plans, and so I always encourage supervisors and managers with their subordinates or teachers with their students, have the student or have the employee make a plan of what it is that they plan to do with and for this organization while they're here, so that when we start seeing things that are off purpose, or people can be reminded, you know, was that a part of your plan? And if not, let's get back to what your plan was as we try to develop and create this sense of equity. We have to allow people to tell their stories and how they got where they are, and who helped them and who they can help, because that really creates an atmosphere where we're recognizing that we didn't just get here on our own. The myth of meritocracy, if many of you haven't heard of that, is basically this idea that I pulled myself up by my bootstraps. I did it all by myself with my own two bare hands. And oftentimes, if we look at people's stories or we listen to them, we can actually demystify their success and recognize that they did have help and that they have helped someone themselves. And so those become really important stories to hear in our attempt to create equity. And then lastly, being able to ask for help, particularly from colleagues or from supervisors. And this sounds interesting, but also asking help from those people we are supposed to be helping. So clients, asking help from them to understand a concept or understand a way of being, or to at least get a perspective on a way of being, even if you can't necessarily or want to understand it. So those become really important steps that we can take to create this idea of equity and diminish or remove these microaggressions. Because the other thing that I want us to recognize is that there's a difference between information and revelation. And information is the data, the statistics that you get, the loads of information that you can use. And again, the word can use to change either behavior or thought pattern. But revelation is when you can actually see what that information, how that information can apply to you and your life, or how that information actually impacts real people. And so many of our organizations have lots of information that we're giving to folks, but very few organizations and individuals are able to see or have a revelation of what that particular information means for the people that they serve, or even for themselves. And so I would encourage that there's a relationship between information and revelation, but revelation is actually what makes people move and change their behaviors in very positive ways. So lastly, I want to give I want to go back to the chat room and see if there were any questions in the chat room. It doesn't look like anyone has any questions in the chat room, and that's fine. We're going to check with one more thing. Okay, cool. And again, before we get to this last piece, if you need your CEUs or you want to find those CEUs, you can email me at andre@amhorizons.com, or you can go to the website, andrecohen.com. You can call us on our conference call line. Those are ways that can be helpful. And as you go to the chat room and you look at the agenda, we're right now right around 5, heading towards 6, which will be our final question and answer period for this particular webinar. And we're really excited for what we were able to do today, and I'm glad that you could join us. So when we go to the last slide in our presentation, these are just simply some steps that you can do to increase your awareness in diminishing or minimizing microaggressions or micro-inequities. And so these are some things that you can do. Be vigilant, be conscious, be thoughtful of your own behavior, be thoughtful of your relationship with others, be thoughtful when people give you feedback, and also ask for feedback on your behaviors, particularly in the workplace, because what we know is that if those things go unchecked, then they actually contribute to this sense of evil. And we know ultimately that people are looking for safety, significance, and belonging, that we want to make sure that we provide the dignity and honor of being human, that the 4 truths about human beings and their behaviors are extremely important to recognize and be a part of, and that when we do those things, we actually create spaces for people to increase their discretionary effort. And another way that, and once their discretionary effort is increased, they move into something that we call empowering, and they empower others to also increase their discretionary effort. But we also know that the converse is true of that as well, which is that when people feel negatively, they operate negatively, and ironically or interestingly enough, they drag other people down, which creates a whole downward spiral within an organization. And so I would encourage you to look at micro inequities in your organization. Ask the question, what things are we doing that is discouraging to people in ways that we can actually measure with their discretionary effort. If you have low morale, if you have people who are disgruntled, and I'm not talking about an individual, but groups of people, those are symptoms or signs that you may have some micro aggressions happening, that micro inequity may be operating in your organization. And to turn that tide, I would suggest that you do a self-analysis or self-study, and I have some of those on my website at andrecohen.com that you can do to look at where your organization is in terms of micro inequities and looking at diversity and inclusion efforts. So if you have people who are disgruntled, they're canaries in the mine, if you will. And those individuals are trying to give you some information about the organization as a whole. And so there you can start looking at your micro inequities. And I would ask you to engage those groups to find out what's going on, and then start doing some micro affirmations, small little things that encourage people to give their personal best. And remember, people are looking for safety, significance, and belonging. And so if you know your employees or you know your students, giving them what they need is okay. So if I need significance, putting me in a position of power that I can handle, that I'm prepared for, giving me responsibilities, having me produce or do or make something becomes extremely important. If I'm looking for safety or security, then that raise may actually motivate me to do more. But if I'm looking for a sense of belonging, putting me on a team where people can engage me becomes an important way for me to be motivated in the workplace. And so those types of things really start to build micro affirmations, which then turn into macro affirmations. We know that money doesn't motivate everybody, that a new title doesn't motivate everyone. But when we look specifically at individuals and we're able to engage them and find out what it is that they need, that's when we start to create this opportunity for equity. And I've dropped that term a couple of times. Equality is making sure that everyone gets the same thing. Equity is making sure that people get what they need. And so it is our belief that all people, need the dignity and honor in being human. And so through this workshop, we hope that you are able to get some tools, some language, some ways of thinking that will allow you to help your organization, your educational institution, give the dignity and honor that people deserve because they exist. And so my name is Andre Cohen. Our time is wrapping up here. I'll go back to the chat room and see if there are any questions. And there don't seem to be any questions, so that's great. Again, if folks want to contact us, I can be reached at andrecohen.com. You can call us on our conference call line and leave a message. You can also sign up for our next webinar, which will be next month, actually in a couple of weeks. And so we look forward to engaging you in that process. If there's anything that we can do for you, CEUs. So again, if you go back to the chat room, there is the information you need to get your CEUs. So just write me at andre@amhorizons.com and we'll get you those CEUs. And I look forward to seeing you in our next webinar. So if there's ever anything we can do for you, just let us know. And I look forward to seeing who you become. My name is Andre Cohen, and thank you for this session. Have a great day.